She's a disgrace. Just army nothing. The words fell unlike rounds slamming into metal, sharp and cold, bouncing around the dinner table until everyone froze. My father laughed as he said it, not a chuckle, but a full, booming laugh, the kind of laugh that carries authority even when it's laced with poison. Silverware clinked to a stop. The smell of roast beef and gravy suddenly turned sour in my throat. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but it was the first time he said it in front of everyone. In front of my groom. I didn't answer. I never did. But James, the man I'd nearly lost on a dirt road halfway around the world, set his fork down, looked straight into my father's eyes, and said with a voice steady as bedrock, "She's the reason I'm still alive." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. You could hear the clock tick, hear someone swallow hard, hear my father's chair creak as his posture stiffened. For the first time, the man who raised me had no comeback. If you want to know how we arrived at that table, how a daughter came to be called a disgrace, and how her groom answered with a truth my father couldn't deny, then let me take you back. The night smelled of polished oak and candle wax. My mother's dining room, though she hadn't lived to see it anymore, still carried the scent of her lavender oil in the curtains. The table was long, mahogany, carved before I was born, and lined with faces that carried traces of both pride and judgment. Dad sat at the head, back straight as if the chair itself were a parade ground. His silver hair was cropped tight, his jaw set, the bronze star pinned to his blazer, even though this wasn't a military function. He was never without his insignias, as if reminding the world and himself what he had earned. I wore my army service dress uniform, not to provoke him, not to make a statement. I wore it because that's who I was. I'd worn it in battle zones, in memorial ceremonies, in lonely offices, at midnight writing letters to families who'd lost their sons. Tonight, I wore it for love, because the man beside me had seen me in blood and fire, and he had asked me to walk into the future the same way I had walked through war, steady, unflinching, true. Dad's laughter sliced through the clatter of plates. She's a disgrace, just army nothing. He looked around, expecting nods, agreement, maybe another laugh. But the room didn't join him. My cousins avoided eye contact. An aunt cleared her throat, too loud, like she wanted to cut the tension. James didn't flinch. His voice carried, low but resolute. She's the reason I'm still alive. My chest tightened. For a moment, I was back there. The smoke, the chaos, the sound of metal tearing, my hands pressing against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. James's eyes finding mine through the haze, the unspoken plea not to let go. And I hadn't. My father's hand gripped his glass tighter, the ice inside clinking like tiny cymbals. But he said nothing. For the first time, nothing. That silence wasn't new. I grew up in it. My father was a man of medals and orders, not words of comfort. I remember being 10 years old, sitting at the same table, knees scraped from falling off my bike. I wanted him to notice, maybe even smile when I said I was fine. Instead, he slid a napkin toward me and muttered, "Soldiers don't whine." That was his love language. Discipline disguised as distance. At 16, when I told him I wanted to enlist, he laughed the same laugh he gave tonight. Said the army was for real soldiers, not for little girls playing dress-up. At 18, when I signed the papers and shipped off, he refused to come to graduation. Army nothing, he called it then too. So when he said it tonight, in front of James, in front of my family, it wasn't new. But the difference was this. I wasn't alone in hearing it anymore. I looked at James, my hand brushing against his beneath the table. His fingers curled around mine, calloused from years in uniform, from holding rifles and ropes and steering wheels on convoys through dust and fire. He wasn't just defending me to win an argument. He was speaking a truth etched into his own skin. The room sat in stunned quiet. My father's eyes narrowed, but no words came. He lifted his glass, drank, and leaned back, the muscles in his jaw working as if chewing on the weight of James's words. For me, the silence felt like an earthquake finally subsiding. Not victory, Not revenge, just a shift. For once, someone else had spoken the truth I had carried alone for years. And my father, for once, had no counterattack. People see a moment like that and think it's sudden, like lightning striking out of nowhere. But lightning is just the end of a storm you didn't see building. That dinner table clash, that single exchange, it was 20 years in the making. It started with a little girl who ironed her father's uniforms, who memorized his medals by heart, who thought the only way to earn his love was to earn his respect. It grew in the silence of a house where duty flew higher than affection, where I love you was never said out loud, and where a girl learned that sometimes the sharpest wounds don't bleed. By the time I was 18, I understood that my life would be lived in his shadow unless I carved a path of my own. And so I did. That path led me here, to the night when his laughter met James's truth and the air between us all turned heavy with recognition. He taught me early that the house belonged to order. Shoes by the door faced the same direction at the same angle. The yard looked like a parade ground, stripes of grass cut to match. Dinner was at 1800, whether the sky was raining or the power was out. He didn't bark so much as pronounce. You knew when a sentence from him ended because the air seemed to have been stamped. The living room wall held a glass case with velvet backing, ribbons aligned, metals catching the light, a black and white photo of him in his prime. Jaw carved, eyes hard, spine like a steel beam. He dusted that case himself on Saturdays, slow strokes as if anything faster would be disrespectful. I used to stand on the edge of the rug and watch, my hands behind my back the way he preferred, wanting him to look up and see me standing right. He liked sons. He didn't have one. He had me. When people at church asked, "Any boys in the family, Colonel?" he'd shrug and say, "Just the one at heart," and tap his chest. The joke got laughs. I laughed too, because that's what kids do when their father cues them. But it planted something that took root, an understanding that I was a placeholder for a plan that never arrived. Mom ran interference like a quiet river around rock. She'd press a hand to my shoulder when he was in a mood and slip me outside to the porch to breathe. Her hands always smelled like lemon oil and book glue from the school library where she worked, and she wore soft sweaters that collected my tears without announcing them. "He is the way the world made him," she'd say, in a voice that asked forgiveness for no one. "You are the way the world will meet you." When I was 11, I ironed his dress shirt while standing on a phone book so I could reach the board. The steam rose and fogged my glasses. He walked by without looking, touched the collar, nodded to the air, and moved on. Mom watched from the doorway and mouthed, "Perfect," like she was blessing me. The first time I said the word army out loud as a plan, it was summer. Cicadas rattling in the maple, heat sticking everything to everything. I was 16. We sat in the kitchen with popsicles sweating down our wrists. "I want to enlist when I finish high school," I said, just like that, like a truth I'd already tried on and found it fit. He laughed. It wasn't cruel at first, more like disbelief smashing into a wall of habit. "Army's a job for men with bags and for women with nurses' caps. You want structure, go to college. You want adventure, read a book." He bit the popsicle until the stick showed. It takes a certain kind. I didn't say anything because I'd seen what happens when you argue with a brick. You bruise. Later that night, I lay awake and listened to the ice maker drop cubes like tiny grenades into the bin and promised the dark that I would become a certain kind. In our house, you earned attention by bringing home things that shone. I brought home things that shone. Debate trophies, science fair ribbons, a certificate for a leadership seminar where I'd been elected team captain. He'd hold them, glance, set them on the counter as if they were receipts. One evening, my guidance counselor called, voice bright, to say West Point's Summer Leaders program had accepted me. I wasn't going to West Point, but the invitation meant something. Dad listened with the phone tucked under his chin while he opened mail. "Appreciate the call," he said, and when he hung up, he tossed the flyer onto the table. They tossed those out like parade candy. I said I wanted to try anyway. He said, "You want uniforms? Learn laundry." I learned laundry. Whites separate, sleeves creased the long way, collars pressed, brass polished with a paste that stained your fingers black and then shiny. I memorized his ribbons because I thought his language was color, and if I could speak it, maybe he'd hear me. Vietnam service, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He didn't like to talk about the war, but it lived in the gaps between words. He would walk through the house in the dark without turning on a light and never bump a thing. He slept with a glass of water, barely touched. When a car backfired 3 streets over, he turned his head the way a deer does. On Memorial Day, he stood straighter than the flagpole. Mom put brochures for state colleges on the counter and left the Armed Forces career pamphlets in the same stack like they'd wandered in by accident. Options, she said. You always get to choose. It sounded simple until it wasn't. Senior year, we toured a campus with brick buildings and trees that arched like cathedral ribs. In the student union, a recruiter table stood near the windows, a small flag on a wire standing at attention, a sergeant with a stack of pamphlets and a posture like he didn't belong to the furniture world. He said, "You look like somebody who likes a challenge," and handed me a brochure without asking my father's permission. Dad said nothing, but when we reached the parking lot, his silence thickened and the drive home cut through it like a dull blade. My mother got sick in the spring. It came fast and ugly, like a storm that doesn't read forecasts. Chemotherapy turned the house into a schedule pinned to the refrigerator, pill times and appointment times and sleep times that ignored circadian rhythms. Dad never missed a dose, never missed a Tuesday blood draw, never missed the laundry. He moved like a man performing a job at the edge of a cliff. Near the end, her voice thinned to threads, but her eyes sharpened. One afternoon, when he'd gone to refill the car with gas, she asked me to bring the blue box from the closet. Inside were letters he'd sent her. Paper yellowed, words looped and cramped, fear disguised as facts. He was softer once, she said. People harden where they're not allowed to feel. She closed my fingers around a small anchor pendant. If you go, go for you. Don't go to prove anything. When she died, the house carried the kind of silence that doesn't wait to be noticed. He folded the flag they gave him at the service with hands that didn't shake, and afterward he went to his chair and stared at an afternoon game on TV without seeing it. I signed my enlistment papers 2 weeks later. I did it on a Wednesday because Wednesdays always sounded like action days. I came home and laid the packet on the table and told him, plain. He stood up so fast his knee knocked the chair back. The veins at his temple rose like braided rope. You think that uniform will fix something that's broken in you? He asked, not yelling, not whispering, accusing. You think you know what you're asking for? I told him I didn't think. I know I'm choosing, he said. Then choose the door. I picked up the packet. I walked to my room and put it under the bed like it might sleep better there. We didn't speak for 3 days. He cooked, I cleaned. He left the mail on the counter. I sorted it, the way you move around a sleeping dog. On Saturday, I wrote a letter to him, the old-fashioned way, because my voice kept cracking when I tried to use it. I said I loved him. I said I wasn't asking permission. I said I'd be at the bus station Monday at 0800. I slid it under his door. He didn't slide anything back. At dawn on Monday, the sky was that pale color that looks like a fresh page. The bus station smelled like coffee burned to bitterness and rubber warmed by motion. The bench was cold through my jeans. I set my duffel at my feet and watched families make shapes out of goodbyes. A little boy in a superhero t-shirt saluted his sister like he meant it. An older couple held hands like lifelines. I waited for footsteps I could identify by weight. None came. The bus pulled up with a sigh like a giant deciding. I boarded. As we rolled past the edge of town, I saw our street for a breath, neat as a photograph. A figure stood in our front window, still and square. He didn't raise a hand, neither did I. Some salutes you don't get, some you earn later, from other people in other rooms. It's a strange thing, leaving a place that has built you and hurt you, knowing both truths will travel with you no matter where you go. The wheels hummed a rhythm the whole way. A low drum I translated into a sentence. You can go. You can go. You can go. I leaned my head against the glass and watched the fields flatten into highway and the highway break into a city. And someone behind me was telling a joke. And someone in front of me was crying into a phone. And the world kept happening. I closed my eyes and pictured the glass case with the metals catching the light. I didn't want to be inside a case. I wanted to be the kind of light that got caught. When the bus turned toward the base, the sign out front looked smaller than I expected, like most thresholds. A guard checked IDs with the patience of a man who'd seen every version of fear. First time? He asked, and I nodded. You'll be fine, he said, and it sounded like a forecast, not a wish. The air smelled different on the other side, cleaner, stripped of whatever scent you had brought with you. I stepped down onto the pavement and felt the ground answer back with a dull thud through my soles. The voice in my head that sounded like him tried to speak. The voice in my chest that sounded like me finally overruled it. Fall in, it said. And I did. They shaved us down to identical edges the first week. Hair, posture, hesitation. At 04:30, the lights slammed on and the bay turned into a storm of metal bunks and shouted names. I learned the language fast. Move with purpose. Eyes front? Yes. Drill sergeant? Fort Jackson smelled like wet canvas and CLP, like old rain pressed into dirt. The cadence on runs settled into my bones until my feet answered before my mind did. Push-ups became punctuation. Blisters grew, broke, hardened. I stopped checking the clock and started reading The Shape of Mornings by the taste of the air. Red Phase gave us the gas chamber. One recruit ripped off his mask too early and staggered out, eyes flooding. I kept mine sealed until they told us to break it. Pepper fire poured into my lungs. The world went grainy and mean. We laughed because there was nothing else to do. White Phase meant rifles. Cold M4s that smelled like oil and temper. We learned to zero, to trust the front sight, to keep the buttstock tucked instead of creeping up the shoulder. On the range, hot brass kissed forearms and left small moons. A drill sergeant said, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." And for the first time, I believed that slowness could be a kind of strength. On Sundays, I wrote letters. I told Dad about cadence calls I liked, and a drill sergeant who could spot a crooked boot from 40 feet. I wrote about the first time I shot expert and how the range smelled like damp soil after rain. I didn't mention the crying 2 bunks down or the way my hands shook the first time I stood guard in the black hour before dawn and every sound felt like a decision. He didn't write back. When a care package came, it was from Aunt Lena. Foot powder, beef jerky, a joke on a napkin. Don't let him see your fear, kiddo. I kept the napkin in my wall locker like a flag. Advanced individual training took me to Fort Sam Houston, halls of medicine sharpened by war. I chose 68W because someone has to be the person you crawl toward when the world breaks. We practiced tourniquets until the motion lived in our wrists. High and tight, windlass turned, time scrawled in Sharpie on the forearm. March became catechism. Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia, head injury. We packed fake wounds with gauze until our knuckles burned. We learned where to push and where not to. In trauma lanes, we ran towards screams that were acting, but our hands didn't know the difference. They only knew what to do. At night, I traced the anchor pendant under my shirt with my thumb. Mom's last gift. Anchor, I whispered, until the word meant a thing you hold and a thing you are. On PT runs along the river, mist held at our shins. The sun broke through like an order obeyed. In the barracks, the air smelled of bleach and stress. I taped my heels, iced my shins, and learned that quiet is a tool. On the range, we drilled casualty movement, cover, drag, treat, talk. I wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but panic seemed to look for a place to settle. I learned to be that place. A square foot of calm on a day that preferred chaos. Orders came folded like secrets. Afghanistan. Logar province. I was a specialist by then, posted to a line company with the gallows humor of people intimate with chance. The outpost smelled of diesel and dust. T-walls stood like bleached bones against a sky so blue it felt brittle. Inside the wire, everything had a list. Outside, list lost to luck. My aid bag waited by the door like a faithful dog. The first time it happened for real, late afternoon hung heavy and metallic. The convoy rolled along a road the locals called safe, with a shrug. The IED took that word and turned it inside out. A flash, a thump like the earth hiccuped. Grit filled my mouth. It tasted like coins. The truck behind us lost a wheel and a chunk of its courage. Small arms chewed at the edges of the sound. I was moving before my mind narrated it. Low, fast, counting. 1, 2, 3. The driver's door was jammed. I went through the back, skinning my knees on torn metal, and found PFC Alvarez slumped, red soaking his pant leg in a dark bloom. Tourniquet high and tight, windlass until he hissed, and then went strangely quiet. I talked to keep him here. Where you from? Who's waiting? While my hands worked. El Paso, he said, teeth pink with dust. My mom makes tamales that could end wars. A round cracked the hood inches from my ribs. Someone laid down suppression like a prayer. I keyed the radio, voice steady, because steadiness is a map. 9-line medevac, line 1 grid. The helo answered with a copy that sounded like a promise. When it was over, the quiet felt borrowed. Alvarez squeezed my wrist and said, "You're made of rebar." "Sleep deprivation and bad coffee," I answered, and he smiled as the bird lifted him toward better hands. Back at the outpost, someone left an MRE peanut butter on my cot with a note that said Anchor. Block letters pressed hard. I didn't correct the mythology. In the days that followed, the name stuck. Not because I weighed people down, but because I didn't drift when the current wanted us gone. We settled into a rhythm made of boredom punctured by panic. The platoon taught me card games. I taught them to check a tourniquet every 15 minutes like it was a promise. On a cold night when the generator coughed its last and the stars came out so many and so close I felt religious, I went to the satellite phone and called home. It rang. It stopped. I left a message I had rehearsed. "Hi, it's me. I'm good. No need to worry." Silence was the only reply that could cross oceans that fast. Some weeks brought rumors and dust. Then came the Valley Patrol, where rocks seemed to breathe and the village kids had eyes that missed no motion. Fire came off a ridge that should have been our friend. SSG Benton dropped with a chest wound that whistled like a bad instrument. I found the entry, found the exit, sealed what I could, slid a needle in the right space, and felt air give way with a soft, obscene sigh. "You're good," he wheezed, surprised. "You're stubborn," I said, and kept my hand on his chest until the rotor wash found us. Letters from home, thin to advertisements and bank notices. I sent one picture after my first Army Achievement Medal. Me squinting in sun that smelled like diesel. Certificate flapping. No caption. A week later, an envelope arrived at the APO with his block script. Inside, "Be careful. It's different out there than you think." I stared until the words blurred. It was the nearest thing to love we'd managed in years. I folded the paper and tucked it into the top pocket of my aid bag until the ink wore soft. Respect didn't arrive like a parade. It showed up as a private asking, halting to look at a rash he wasn't brave enough to show anyone else. It showed up as a sergeant admitting he hadn't slept and needed a place to put that truth. Men sat on ammo cans and let their fear breathe near me. I pressed the lid shut gently and sent them back lighter. I learned how quiet can be a tool, how steadiness can be louder than a shout. Later, there would be another road, another blast, another man whose blood found my hands and wouldn't let go. That would be James. Before the dinner table, before the words disgrace and nothing tried to define me, there was this. Miles of ruck straps biting shoulders, the taste of pennies in my mouth, the feel of a windlass biting my palm, the click of a radio when a pilot says, "Copy," inbound. All the small, untelevised choices where I decided to be the person someone crawls toward in the dark and finds alive. The convoy stretched like a tired spine across the valley floor, dust rising in curtains that clung to skin and teeth. We'd been on the road since dawn, the kind of day when the sun climbed without mercy, and the metal of the Humvees burned to the touch. I sat behind the driver, aid bag propped at my boots, ears tuned for sounds that didn't belong, the wrong kind of silence, the too sudden shout of birds, the crack that didn't come from suspension springs. James was 2 vehicles ahead, manning a turret with eyes that tried to drink the horizon faster than thirst. He was young then, a specialist with an accent still clinging to his vowels, shoulders not yet hardened but stubborn. The blast came like a fist from underneath. 1 second, the convoy rattled in rhythm, the next it bucked. Fire and dirt lifting the third truck into the air like a toy hurled by a cruel child. The sound wasn't one sound, but many. Metal shrieking, men cursing, radios barking in overlapping panic. My head hit steel, my mouth filled with dust that tasted of salt and rust. Training shoved me forward before thought did. My body knew the steps. Get low, count heartbeats, move. The truck that burned was James's. Shouts came over the net. Man down, man down. And my boots were already chewing the dirt. Rounds snapped overhead, wild and probing from a ridge. I felt the air move where one passed too close. I dropped behind what was left of a wall, counted, then sprinted again. My lungs burned, but my legs didn't care. The Humvee had collapsed inward. The turret bent at an obscene angle. I crawled through a gap jagged enough to slice and found him half buried under twisted frame. Blood darkened his left side, seeping faster than cloth could hold. His eyes found me through soot. "Don't," he started, then coughed. I cut the belt, dragged him inch by inch until we spilled into the dirt together. He was heavier than fear and lighter than choice. "Stay with me," I said, voice low but sharp, like a command dressed as comfort. Tourniquet high, tight, windless until the bleeding slowed. His breath rattled, shallow. I pressed my hand to his chest, felt broken ribs argue with my palm. Needle decompression, angle, depth, hiss of air like a secret leaving. His face eased a fraction. "You're stubborn," I told him, my throat dry. Rounds still spit from the ridge, answered by our gunners, laying steel skyward. The air was an argument in languages no one wanted to translate. I crouched over him, using my body as whatever shield it could be. He whispered something through cracked lips. "Don't let go." I gritted my teeth, adjusted pressure on the bandage, and promised without words. The medevac bird came in with a roar that churned the dirt into a storm. Hands helped lift him onto the litter. Straps snapped into place. I climbed aboard, holding the IV high as the floor trembled. His eyes rolled toward me, unfocused, and then steadied just enough to see. I squeezed his wrist. "Not today," I said. At Bagram, surgeons pulled shrapnel and stitched what they could. I sat outside the OR with blood on my uniform and sand in my teeth. Hours later, a nurse came out and said, "He'll make it, because someone out there didn't freeze." I nodded, but my chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the inside and left the shell standing. Days passed. He hobbled into the ward where I checked on other patients, ribs wrapped, leg braced. "You," he said simply, pointing at me. "You did that." I shrugged, checking his vitals like it was just another task. "You did the living," I answered. But his eyes held mine longer than protocol allowed, and something lodged between us that wasn't gratitude, wasn't romance yet, something harder to name. When he returned to the line months later, still limping but determined, he carried a quiet respect that spread faster than rumor. The platoon called me Anchor, but he called me by my name, like saying it meant something solid. We fought through the same valleys, ate the same chalk-dry rations, traded shifts at checkpoints where the night grew teeth. He'd toss me the last pack of Skittles like it was contraband, and I'd split my water when his ran low. Small exchanges in a place where nothing small lasted. By the time deployment ended, the bond had set like cement under pressure. We parted at the airfield with handshakes that lingered, promises spoken in glances more than words. Months later, stateside, he found me. I was leaving the gym when a voice called my name, and there he was, cleaner, stronger, a scar in his jaw that hadn't been there before. He smiled, with teeth still chipped from that day. "I never got to buy you dinner," he said. Dinner turned into more, long walks, late talks, silences that didn't ache. He carried his ghosts like I carried mine, but somehow they learned to sit quietly when we were together. He told me once, "When I woke up on that bird and saw your hand still on me, I thought, maybe there's a future I get to see." That was when I knew this wasn't just survival. This was something built from fire that didn't burn out. So when he sat at my father's table years later, heard the word disgrace tossed like a grenade, he wasn't defending me for politeness. He was telling the truth as only a man who had nearly bled out in my arms could. "She's the reason I'm still alive." The silence that fell wasn't the awkward hush of manners. It was a silence of truth finally spoken into a room that had never wanted to hear it. Promotion came with ceremony, but also with absence. The first time I pinned sergeant, the company commander shook my hand while my squad clapped with the rowdy relief of men who knew they could count on me to run them hard but fair. I sent a picture home, me standing at attention, stripes new and stiff on my sleeve. The envelope came back weeks later, unopened, returned to sender, stamped in red across the top. I kept it anyway, slid it between the pages of my field manual like a pressed flower. By staff sergeant, I stopped expecting applause from the address I once called home. Instead, recognition came from the quiet nods of soldiers who trusted me to carry weight heavier than packs. When one of them froze on a live fire range, rifle slack at his side, eyes wide with something that had nothing to do with bullets, I stepped in, placed a hand on his shoulder, and walked him through the drill until muscle memory carried him forward again. Later that night, he left a folded scrap on my cot. "Thanks for not letting me drown." That was worth more than any commendation. Mom's absence carved deeper than Dad's silence. I wrote letters I couldn't send, tucked them in the bottom of my duffel, updates she'd never read. When the base chaplain held Sunday services in the open air, I went not for scripture, but for the hush that gathered when everyone bowed their heads at once. In that collective quiet, I imagined her voice, soft, telling me storms aren't meant to stay grounded. One winter deployment in Kandahar, we lost Sergeant Hawk Hawthorne to a sniper's round that cut cleaner than air. I was the one who delivered the folded flag to his wife. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't. And when she whispered, "Thank you for bringing him home," I felt the words land like shrapnel. That night, I scrubbed the smell of gunpowder from my hands until the skin turned raw, but it didn't fade. Dad didn't call. Not when Hawk fell, not when I re-upped, not when I was assigned platoon sergeant at 26. Silence was his language, and I'd grown fluent. Still, I tried. Each promotion, each medal, I sent a photo. Lieutenant bars on my collar, Army Commendation Medal pinned crooked because the major's hands shook. I never saw a reply. Once, through a mutual friend, one of his old Army buddies, I heard he kept the pictures in a drawer, not displayed, not destroyed, just hidden, like me. James came back into my orbit during those years, steady and stubborn. His recovery had been brutal. Nights where pain carved deeper than shrapnel ever did. He never hid it from me. He called once, middle of the night, his voice ragged. "You were there when I almost left. Can you be here while I stay?" I answered without hesitation, always. From then on, we carried each other. When another tour pulled me east again, he wrote me weekly. No fluff, just words that held like rope. "Still here, still waiting, be safe." On missions, I tucked his letters into the flap of my body armor. Paper wore soft from sweat and dust. but the ink stayed. In firefights, when the world narrowed to muzzle flashes and shouted coordinates, the thought of those letters steadied my hands. The gap between me and my father grew into a canyon. At family funerals, he stood stiff, avoiding my eyes. Once, at my cousin's wedding, he passed me in the hall, medals gleaming on his blazer. He said nothing, but his glance dipped to my uniform and lingered. For a second, I thought he might speak. He didn't. He brushed past, leaving the air colder than before. By the time James asked me to marry him, my career had turned into a climb I never planned but refused to abandon. Master Sergeant stripes on my sleeve, deployments behind me, soldiers I still called by name in dreams. He asked me under a quiet sky, no fireworks, no spectacle, just two people on a park bench, hands locked. "Let me serve beside you," he said, simple as that. I said yes, not because I needed saving, but because someone finally understood that service wasn't a job. It was marrow. Planning the wedding brought the divide into sharp relief. James wanted my family there, even if only to try. I sent invitations, one addressed to my father. Weeks passed, no reply. Then, the rehearsal dinner? He came. Not with congratulations, but with that laugh that had followed me since 16. "She's a disgrace, just Army nothing." He said it in front of James, in front of everyone. I sat still, pulse steady, because years in uniform had trained me to absorb blows without flinching. But when James answered, "She's the reason I'm still alive," I felt the ground shift. For once, my father's silence wasn't punishment, it was surrender. And in that moment, I realized I no longer needed him to fill it with anything. The night before the wedding, I laid out my uniform on the bed the way I'd been taught. Creased sleeves, brass polished, until they caught the lamplight like fireflies. James stayed at a friend's house, some old tradition about sleeping apart before vows. Alone, I pressed the iron, slow, steam rising like ghosts. My fingers lingered over the ribbons stitched in neat rows, each one a story nobody at the chapel would hear. I touched the fabric the way some brides touch lace, reverent and trembling. 4 rows down, I paused on the purple heart, not mine, but the one I carried for the men who didn't come home. I smoothed the fabric and whispered their names like prayer beads. Morning came bright, the kind of blue sky that looks painted. The chapel stood white and solemn, its doors tall enough to hold history. Outside, engines idled. Men arriving in uniforms pressed sharper than mine. They weren't invited, not formally. They came because leaving me to walk that aisle alone wasn't something they could stomach. Some limped, some carried scars hidden under fabric, all carried eyes that had seen the same fire. They lined the walkway, a formation of ghosts made flesh, and nodded when I stepped out of the car. One leaned close and whispered, "You carried us through hell. Let us carry you to this." Inside, the rehearsal dinner still clung to memory. Dad had shown his teeth in laughter that cut. His words still hung in my chest. Disgrace? Nothing. I expected the sting to follow me into the chapel, but instead, I felt lighter. James had answered for me in a way no one ever had. For once, the truth wasn't mine alone to defend. We gathered in the side room, the one where brides usually adjusted veils. My veil was brass buttons and pressed fabric. The chaplain, an old Navy man with kind eyes, patted my shoulder and said, "The right kind of vows don't need lace to hold." His words steadied me more than he knew. Guests filled the pews. Families rustled in dresses and suits. The air hummed with low whispers and the faint smell of polished wood. Then, from the back of the room, a sound cut the hum. Boots. Dozens, then hundreds. The SEALs, the soldiers, the friends who had come without invitation filled the chapel. Not just to witness, but to stand. The doors opened. My heels struck wood in rhythm, each step measured, not as a march, but as a declaration. The room rose with me. Not polite shuffling, not half-hearted. One sharp motion, chairs scraping, metals catching light, bodies at attention. "Admiral on deck," someone shouted at another wedding long ago. Today, the words weren't needed. They stood for an army sergeant walking toward her vows, because respect isn't rank alone. It's the life you lived in front of them. And then, the moment I will never forget. My father sat in the third pew, arms crossed, jawstone. He didn't stand. The sight should have cut me, but it didn't, because to my left and right, row after row of warriors rose without hesitation. Their silence thundered louder than any applause. They saluted without moving hands, just by standing tall, unshaken. James waited at the altar, eyes steady, the kind of look that says, "I see you, all of you, and I still choose this." My chest tightened, not from nerves, but from honor. Dad had his silence, but here was mine, multiplied by hundreds. Later, at the reception, the air softened. Laughter spilled like a relief valve. Someone clinked a glass for a toast. My old squad leader stood, cleared his throat, and raised his drink. "To the one who never let us feel small," he said. The men banged the table in agreement, and for a moment, the sound was like mortars. Only this time, it carried joy. I saw Dad watching from the edge of the room, glass untouched, shoulders square. His lips parted once like he wanted to speak, but closed again. James slid a hand over mine. "He doesn't get to define this," he said. I nodded. For the first time, I believed it. The clash at the rehearsal dinner had been a wound ripped open in front of everyone. The wedding itself was the salve. My father's silence still hurt, but the voices that rose around me that day, James's defense, the soldiers' unspoken salute, proved something he never could erase. "She's a disgrace," he had laughed. But in the hush of the chapel, in the way men who bled beside me stood when I walked, I learned the truth I had chased for decades. Blood may stay seated, but honor stands. The photographs from the wedding faded into frames on our wall, but the memory lived sharper than any picture could hold. James and I started our life together in a small rented house near base, where the smell of coffee and polish became our routine. He called it home, I called it staging ground, but in truth, it was both. On quiet mornings, he would trace the scar along his ribs, the one I'd dressed years before, and say, "Still here, because of you." I would kiss the line of scar tissue, not to erase it, but to honor what it carried. Months after the wedding, a cream envelope arrived in my mailbox, handwriting I knew before I unfolded it, my father. The note inside was spare. He wrote that he hadn't known how to sit among people who saw in me what he'd refused to. He admitted he was wrong, that he wanted to talk. No uniform, no protocol, just a father trying to understand a daughter. I read it 3 times, hands steady, heart conflicted. For years, I had dreamed of those words. When they finally came, they landed like rain on soil that had hardened. Still, I didn't throw it away. James found me at the kitchen table that evening, letter flat against the wood. "Do you want to meet him?" he asked. I shook my head first, then nodded. "I don't owe him anything." James leaned closer. "Maybe you owe yourself the choice." His words stayed with me. We met at Arlington, the only ground where silence feels holy. We stood at my mother's headstone, grass trimmed sharp, marble bright against the sky. He wore civilian clothes, no medals, no armor. Just a man, smaller than memory. I wore my uniform not to make a point, but because it was me. He looked at me and whispered, "You stand like your mother did." For the first time, his voice cracked. We talked about grief, about fear, about how silence can masquerade as strength but is only another kind of weakness. When it was time to leave, he straightened, hand lifting slow to his brow. The salute wasn't crisp, it was clumsy, but it was real. I returned it, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. That night, I lay beside James and whispered, "He saluted." James didn't ask what it meant. He just held my hand in the dark. Life moved forward. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a Pentagon roundtable on ethical command. They didn't want me for being the first woman in my position. They wanted me because I had built systems that saved lives. I told them leadership isn't the loudest voice. It's the calmest in chaos. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned in moments no one sees. When I finished, the room rose to its feet. Applause filled the air. I thought of the wedding, of the chapel, of the way strangers had stood for me when my father hadn't. A week later, another envelope arrived. Inside, his handwriting again. He admitted he had watched the speech online. He wrote that he finally understood I had built a life not to defy him, but to serve others. He included a photo from the wedding, taken from the back row. In it, 200 stood saluting. And in the corner, one man remained seated. Him. He wrote, "I missed the moment then. I hope I haven't missed it forever." Months passed. Slowly, he began to show up. He attended a training session where cadets saluted me, his hands folded at his chest. He shook my hand afterward, rough palm meeting mine. "I'm proud of you," he said, quieter, "and I'm sorry it took me so long." His words weren't absolution. They were a start. Legacy arrived in unexpected ways. One of the men I had saved named his daughter after me. She grew up, joined the army, and the day I met her on a training roster, she smiled shyly and said, "My father told me you gave him back to us." It struck me then, what we do doesn't end with medals or ceremonies. It ripples forward into lives we never see coming. The final moment came 1 year after the wedding. I stood on stage accepting the Department of Defense's Award for Excellence in Ethical Command. James sat in the front row. My father sat in the back corner. When the cadets stood to salute, so did he. His hand rose, slow but certain, and for the first time, it stayed. Afterward, as we stepped into the evening air, my phone buzzed. A message from one of my old soldiers. "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am. Never seen that many warriors cry at a ceremony. Blood didn't salute, but we did." I showed it to James. He smiled and asked, "You going to reply?" I typed back, "Some salutes stay with you forever." Some people believe revenge is about crushing what crushed you, but the most lasting victory is building what they never believed you could. You don't always need to strike back. Sometimes you just need to stand, steady and unbroken, and let the world rise to meet you. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the people who stood for you when others wouldn't. Share your memory, or carry it quietly, but don't forget it. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience and quiet triumph, join me again. We rise together.